Is it a war? Is it not a war? Is it a ceasefire? Is it not a ceasefire? All we know is Canadians are getting hosed at the gas pump because of the ongoing conflict in Iran. It started way back on February 28th, and here we are at the end of May, and we have no idea when it ever will truly end. To talk more about it, talking about Paul, Brian, gentlemen, this is something I didn't think we'd still be talking about this many months later, but here we are, and it's still going on.
It is, Jim. And prior to the show, I was mentioning to both of you that I had watched a podcast, and if you know, we're loving doing the podcast thing here at True Patriot Love. But you know, I was watching Diary of a CEO.
Oh, he's fantastic, Stephen,
right?
yeah.
And Professor Zhang was on, and you know, I don't agree with everything he says, but quite frankly, he had a whole theory on what was happening in Iran, and we tied that the other day to a show we did on CUSMA. So stay with me for a minute because it's very interesting. You watch what's happening with oil and gas prices, what's happening now with CUSMA. Now with CUSMA, we did another show where Jameson Greer comes out just as we're editing the show, and he says, I'm going to Mexico. I'm not bringing the Canadians. I'm going to have a negotiation with the Mexicans. And you know what? I'm going to come back July 1, and I'm going to tell you if I want to continue our 16-year deal on CUSMA, or if I want to say goodbye to it and just go year to year, or if I want to terminate it. And everyone's like, big gulp. Then on the heels of that, he comes out and he made basically 4 statements that I thought were really compelling. The first one, he said, the U.S. are going to be talking about rules of origin in a way that enhances U.S. content in all goods in the Western Hemisphere. So think about that for a minute. Because that's fresh out of the National Defense Paper, National Defense Strategy, that we read out in December. And when we read it, I was like, wow. I thought it was earth-shattering when we read it out in December. No one really looked at it. It actually got put on a shelf. But, you know, for those of you who have time this weekend, when you're bored and you're sitting around reading or doing or by the pool, read it. Because it is a very interesting document, which a part of it talks about how economy is the essential fundamental to national strategy, to national security. So
I can't see anyone arguing with that one.
No. How about economic security?
Yeah.
2, negotiations. And this is Greer again. Negotiations are also going to focus on external tariff coordination with the goal of reducing the amount of Chinese products entering the U.S. supply chains through Canada and Mexico, which is again fresh out of this national security paper. 3, U.S. tariffs on Mexico and Canada aren't going away. The U.S. government is going to have tariffs as long as we have giant deficits. So in other words, we are always going to have tariffs. So regardless of what we negotiate in CUSMA or USMA or whatever we want to call it, we're going to have tariffs. And then number 4, if the U.S. can come to good terms with Mexico and others in the region on external tariffs, it makes it easier for us to give preferential treatment to people in the region. So in other words, if you abide by or you actually work with us on how we're going to tariff the rest of the world, we're going to be good to you in the Western Hemisphere.
Correct. However, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has already fired a shot across their bow this week with some pretty big defense contracts, both by bypassing Boeing and America for their next generation of AWAC planes. Canada's never had an AWAC plane. We've always sent air crew to join the AWAC planes, the famous E3, and that has always been in the NATO base in Brussels. Now here, we just bought 6 Saab Bombardier, Canadian-made, Canadian-produced AWAC planes, bypassing Boeing. And they signed other deals bypassing American manufacturers to buy their own equipment. And I think that has really put a bee in the bonnet of the Pentagon and the U.S. government, because they're telling Canada, and it was a leaked memo, that, this is your things. You have to buy this, this, and this. And here's the supplier. And Canada's giving them the big middle finger saying, no, we're going to buy from somebody else.
Well, I think that's a foolish move by Canada, to be quite honest with you. I think that's absolute stupidity. How are we going to compete with the United States? They have historically been our greatest ally. Historically, they've been willing to defend us if something horrible were to happen. Historically, we've amalgamated ourselves into their sports, into their culture. They're not this giant monster that they're being made out to be.
Mm-hmm.
If you turn back the clock and you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, we had tariffs. We had tariffs all the way along for a very, very long time. And then free trade was introduced, and everyone complained about free trade. It was going to be a horrible thing. It was going to decimate the nation.
Until it wasn't.
Until it wasn't. And now it's not looking so great in the global economy. And tariffs may be the necessary evil required to bring the Western Hemisphere back to prominence on the world stage. The Western Hemisphere was unbeatable through the 60s and 70s and even the early 80s. So I don't know why we would push against the United States with such force and try and embarrass them. I think that what we should be doing is maybe, there's an old saying, seek to understand, not to be understood. And right now, I have a sneaking suspicion that Prime Minister Carney, small in stature, loud in voice, is walking around saying, look at me, I'm going to thump my chest, and by the way, thumb in your eye, and that sort of...
And I'm not disagreeing with you, Brian, but he did paint himself in a corner a couple months ago when he said he proclaimed that 70% of our future military purchases would be Canadian ties or Canadian manufacturing. So these Global Eye AWAC planes they're buying are Swedish/Saab technology built at the Bombardier plant in Montreal. And they're trying to sign every deal he's trying to sign now that $7 out of $10 is spent in Canada with ties to Canadian jobs. So, I mean, that's his mandate as prime minister now.
No. And I get it. And Jameson Greer, we're going to throw the clip on the screen now.
And the reality is we've spent the past year and a half going to countries telling them we have to have some level of tariff on the globe to deal with this giant deficit we're dealing with, to try to reshore, et cetera. And most countries have, I know grudgingly, but they've said, we understand your policy. We understand, so we're going to negotiate with you. We're going to remove some of these tariffs and non-tariff barriers, et cetera. Canada's approach has been different. They, like China, retaliated against the United States. Two countries in the world retaliated against us: People's Republic of China and Canada. So they're just in a different spot.
He's still criticizing us. So we're still getting criticism over kind of our pushback. And he's saying, China and Canada are the only two that push back on the tariff front. So I think we have to walk that line very finely. But, I want to get into, because this is a really interesting thing. I want to get into not only the national security strategy, but I also want to talk about Iran for a minute. Because, we're kind of walking a funny line right now, because as Canadians, we're waiting to see the outcome of what's going to happen in Iran. And for most people, when I talk to now, they're like, is that still going on? Today, we saw they're trying to get a 60-day ceasefire in place. You mentioned it on the intro, Jim. And when we all woke up and we saw Maduro being, hauled out of Venezuela, and then we saw the U.S. entering into Iran, we all thought, okay, this is going to be short. This is going to be quick. This is going to be short. Well, it turns out it's not. And Jim, I got to give you credit, because when that happened, you said, this is not going to be short. You said the topography of Iran is much different than Iraq. And quite frankly, one being desert and flat, and the other being mountainous and hard to conquer.
Because all their stuff's hidden in the rock. Exactly. They can't find it.
Exactly. But, the U.S. was in a funny spot. So, we don't talk about it a lot. And I know, Professor Young on the show with Stephen on Diary of a CEO, he mentioned it. And it was a really interesting point. He basically said that the U.S. was in such a precarious position because when Russia and the Ukraine basically went to war, the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese started to form a faction. Mm-hmm. And looking at the petrodollar and looking at gold as a standard. And it put the U.S. in a very uncomfortable situation. So, I started the show when you did your intro with, economic stability, right, is the key to national stability. And so the U.S. was looking at